We're wasting helium, an Atari Archives look at Circus Atari. Atari's fourth and final game from June 1980 follows in the footsteps of games like Night Driver, Outlaw, Indy 500, and numerous others in being a home conversion of a 1970s arcade game that is much, much better known today by its VCS counterpart. And much like Outlaw before it, Circus Atari, or the much more direct Sears title, Circus, is an unlicensed version of another company's original. In this case, it's Exidy's 1977 arcade game simply named Circus. Circus, and by extension Circus Atari, is a take on the brick-breaking formula established by Atari's Breakout. Instead of bouncing a ball off a paddle into a wall of colored bricks, however, the player controls a seesaw operated by two clowns. At the start of each life, one of the clowns will bounce off the platform on the side onto the seesaw, sending their counterpart flying up into 3 rows of drifting balloons. Popping balloons earns points. Clearing one of the 2 bottom rows gets the player bonus points, while clearing the uppermost will earn you points and a free life. It's a clever game that is more interesting than Breakout, and serves as something of a counterpoint to that title co-designed by the father of the single-player ball and paddle genre, Howell Ivey. As mentioned in the Breakout episode, Ivey was a developer with the company Ramtech in the early 1970s, creating their arcade game Clean Sweep, which would later serve as the inspiration within Atari for Breakout. Ivey would eventually leave Ramtech to co-found Exidy with Pete Kaufman and Bob Newsom, where he would kick off the company's arcade legacy with Destruction Derby and, more famously, Death Race, an arcade game with the premise of running over, and I quote, gremlins with your car. Ivey paved the way for Exidy to move into microprocessor-based arcade games with his next title, Car Polo, before reusing much of that hardware for the company's next game. Ivey explained in an interview with Retro Gamer magazine that since developing new hardware was difficult, he liked to find ways to reuse as much of what they already had designed as possible. As such, much of the same hardware used in Car Polo would be reused again for this unique twist on Breakout, which was based on an idea by Kaufman.
For instance, when your guy hits the seesaw?
In the case of Circus, Ivey and his co-designer, Edward Value, did more than just trade out the cars from Car Polo for balloons. Circus features flailing, hapless stick figures that represent your clowns. Ivey said it was a way to inject some personality into the game, and alongside the lighthearted premise of it, to try and draw in more female players. While I don't have demographic breakdowns of Circus's player base, it was in any case a huge success for Exidy, with an estimated 7,000 units sold in 1978. Circus became one of the biggest hits that year, with the company's facilities being filled up with Circus machines as their manufacturing worked on the necessary parts for the game. This situation led to Exidy licensing the game out to Bally Midway, which released its own version as Clowns, and crucially to Taito for the Japanese release under the title Acrobat. Breakout was a massive success in Japan, and Circus did incredibly well for itself in that country, inadvertently sparking the video game music genre. The designers included a few little tunes in Circus that play when you start the game, when you lose, and when you pop the top row of balloons. Exidy in fact billed the game as the first arcade game that generated its own music without needing a tape player or some other specialized hardware. These and the game's sound effects were noticed by the music industry veterans that contemporaneously formed Japanese supergroup Yellow Magic Orchestra, Ryuichi Sakamoto, Haruomi Hosono, and Yukihiro Takahashi. YMO would sample it in other early arcade games for their first self-titled album in November 1978. Their track Computer Game, Theme from the Circus, opened the album, and alongside the second track Firecracker, would be a successful single in Japan, the US, and the UK. Computer Game would influence the hip-hop and techno scenes outside of Japan, and Hosono would produce one of the first full-length albums specifically for game music in 1984, simply titled Video Game Music. YMO itself would form the record label GMO in 1985 to publish video game soundtracks until the mid-1990s. Suffice it to say, Circus casts an unexpectedly long shadow in some interesting corners of the video game space. Unsurprisingly for such a big arcade hit, Circus would find its way home, both as a number of clones on computer hardware and clones to game consoles. Bally Midway got there first on the professional arcade platform, releasing a version in 1978 that uses the Clowns branding of the company's own arcade rendition of Circus. In a 1982 interview with Electronic Games, developer Bob Ogden mentioned that this was not only his first game program that he'd ever written, It was among the first home games to use 4 kilobytes of memory space for the program. Electronic Games author Arnie Katz declared Ogden's home version was so good that it hadn't really been surpassed in the years since. By all rights, dropping this home version of Clowns so shortly after the arcade release should have been quite a coup for Bally. Unfortunately for the company, the professional arcade suffered from production and quality assurance problems from its planned fall 1977 release all the way through its actual debut year in 1978. These issues, coupled with Bally's minimal experience with the consumer electronic space in general, lost it all the potential momentum it could have had, and the machine would remain a bit player in the market essentially its entire shelf life. Nevertheless, this early home version has your flailing clowns popping well-rendered balloons alongside musical stingers, making it a solid take of a then very new game. Atari's own version was developed by Michael Lorenzen, who we'd seen not too long ago with fellow June release Golf. While I haven't gotten to speak with Lorenzen myself, some years ago he did talk with Ferg of the 2600 Game by Game podcast, who relayed to me some of Lorenzen's development memories for Circus Atari. Lorenzen told him that Circus Atari was originally started by another developer entirely who couldn't get the game to work. This developer then either left the company or was fired, and Lorenzen took up the task of completing the game. Eventually, this developer came back as a consultant to finish the title, keeping the working floppies in a locked cabinet. Since Lorenzen had the keys to said cabinet, he continued to work on it after the other guy had left for the day. Who this other developer was, and if they actually were fired, are unknown, but Lorenzen remembers that the game took about 7 months to be completed, and that he was paid a $7,000 bonus for his work on the game. Whatever the development troubles that the game went through, Lorenzen and his mystery collaborator put together an excellent version of Circus for the VCS. A major key difference between this and the other versions is that the paddle button can be used to flip the seesaw. This is something of a compromise solution for not having the extended platforms to the side for the clowns to land on and bounce off. While small platforms exist, these are really deliberately built out of blank space where the VCS is using the lack of graphical data to perform more calculations than it normally would be. The clown sprites themselves retain the flailing personality and charm of the arcade original, and help make everything feel that much more out of control. The difficulty switches add to this sensation. By flipping it over to A, that player's clowns will bounce around much more quickly than they do in the B position. The default game type, known in the manual as Breakout Circus, follows the arcade game's rules pretty well. Balloons only respawn when you clear a row, clowns bounce off the balloons in all directions, and clearing the top row gets you an extra life. Other game types begin offering up some interesting twists on the formula. The cart includes breakthrough circus modes that call back to the variant of the same name on the VCS Breakout cart, where the clown won't bounce off the balloons vertically, but only horizontally. This allows players to clear an entire row with a bit more ease than they would in the default game type. An additional variant keeps the balloons from respawning until all 3 rows have been cleared, while a final 2-player variant simply makes both players share the same balloon playfield. Several of these game types add in a row of barriers spaced out below the balloons that players have to navigate past in order to hit the balloons. While these can be a bit bothersome to get through given the limited amount of control that you have over your clown in the first place, they can actually work out in your favor if the clown begins bouncing off the top sides of the barriers and catches onto a series of balloons. It's a nice twist to add an additional challenge to the game with a minimal amount of new graphical elements needed. The variations add some longevity to the package, and I can't overstate how funny it is to see these little stick figures crash and burn when you whiff a catch. Much like the Bally arcade conversion, the personality of the original comes through, even if this lacks the bells and whistles of its earlier counterpart. If there is something to complain about with this cart, it's that Circus Atari suffers from a lack of clarity in how to get the clowns to consistently bounce high enough to reach the balloons. Is it a number of bounces? Is it where they land on the seesaw? It's hard to tell for sure, and while this isn't a unique issue to Atari's conversion, it does seem the most affected by it. The core game is pretty exciting, though, so this is really more of a small gripe than anything major. Indeed, like its arcade counterpart, Circus Atari seemed to have wide appeal. The September 1981 issue of Creative Computing looked at the game and noted that it was one of the handful of games from their roundup that was well liked by all the members of its eclectic review panel. Lorenzen claims that Circus Atari ended up selling 2.7 million copies, though it's unclear if those numbers are accurate. Jerome Domeret's internal sales document suggests that Circus Atari sold 148,756 copies in its first year. The subsequent years are cut off in the image we have. These are a drop in the bucket compared to Space Invaders and are slightly below other games available that year, such as Night Driver, Air Sea Battle, and Breakout. But given the game's fairly prominent place in newspaper advertising alongside Night Driver, it's clear the Circus Atari was in demand. In its later years, that demand seemed pretty consistent, as the game sold just over 85,000 to 500 copies between 1986 and 1990. Circus Atari may not have been the prettiest or flashiest game on the shelf, but all indications are that it was a pretty strong one. While you'd think Circus as a game concept would have been pretty long in the tooth by 1982, it did not stop North American Philips developer Jim Butler from bringing it to the Odyssey 2 platform that year. Oddly licensed in North America as P.T. Barnum's Acrobats, and simply known as Jumping Acrobats in its European video pack release, this version trades in the paddles seen in other renditions for the Odyssey 2's joystick. While this loses the fine control seen in the Atari and Bally home versions, the size of the sprites and the seesaw, along with the generous 9 lives the game gives you, allows this to work well enough to be playable. What really sets this version apart is that it is compatible with the Odyssey 2 voice module, which had just come out the month before. The voice is a voice synthesis attachment that plugs into the console's cartridge port, with its own speaker and volume gauge for the actual voice to come from. This was a little trickier than it sounds on the programming side of things. Another Odyssey 2 developer, Bob Cheesham, explained that the storage limitations on the cartridge and how memory was accessed. Functionally, all the voice clips had to be accessed while the system was doing its vertical retrace between frames. They would have to buffer up the voice samples to play during that window of time, and then jump the program back to the portions of memory needed to run the actual game. While he said it wasn't too technically challenging, it was another thing to keep track of. More difficult was ensuring that there was a good enough mix of voice clips. P.T. Barnum's Acrobats features what is known colloquially as the game show host, pre-existing voice samples used in several Odyssey 2 games. These play as you pop balloons, lose a life, or leap off the platforms on the side. And all may not have the variety of the Atari rendition or the fidelity of the Bally version, but the core qualities of Circus are here, and if you were one of the 1 million households with an Odyssey 2 instead of a VCS, this was a good alternative. Exidy went out of business in the 1990s, and in 2007 Kaufman announced that several of the company's early games, including Circus, would be available for free, non-commercial usage. Thus, while other companies, largely in Japan, have produced and sold new renditions of the game, the original version of Circus has very much moved away from the retail re-release realm in favor of the world of arcade emulation. But Circus Atari's home version has continued to see republication on modern compilations. And some years ago, a homebrew port was even written for the Atari 7800 platform that still uses the paddle controllers. From video game musical soundtracks and on-screen character animation, to early consumer voice synthesis and the emulation scene, the unexpected legacy of a title about launching panicky people at balloons continues to weave its way through the world of video games even today. Next time, the first third-party company arrives to go fishing.